Hi everyone, Elliot Jacobson here for Advanced Advantage Play, and today I want to read you an email and talk about that email just a little bit. Now, you need to stick around to the very end because this email exchange I had with this person ends with a true gem and you have to see it. Any rate, here's what we're going to be talking about today. The subject today is gambler's fallacy versus mean reversion. So let's just get right into it here. Here's the email. All right, got this email, look, just on July 29th, so that would be 2 days ago. Hi Elliot, I stumbled across your videos on baccarat on YouTube. I appreciate your no BS mathematical approach. Thank you. I've never played a hand of baccarat, but over the past week I've developed an interest in it after hearing, and I had to redact the name. I'm sure you've heard of him and his claim he's been banned by casinos because he won too much using a baccarat system. I'm skeptical of everything, so I dug into his videos. He never describes his system and he doesn't seem credible. He only says that casinos cheat and he's reverse engineered their cheat to gain an edge. But I can't stop thinking about the idea of developing an edge in the game. Hey, you have come to the right place. I've written a whole book about it. I have lots of videos on it. There are all sorts of ways to get an edge on baccarat. They all require information. Keep that in mind, all right, as I go through this information. That's going to come back. Any rate, he goes on. I'm a professional futures trader. Good. Most of my trades can be characterized as mean reversion trades, where I'm expecting price to revert back to a previous high volume value area. Now, I'm not an expert in futures trading, so I don't have any particular insight into this method. But then he goes on to say, I'm wondering if mean reversion can be applied to baccarat. Again, I've yet to play a hand of baccarat, so I apologize if what I'm about to say isn't correct. And he goes on. From what I've read, there are about 60 to 80 hands in a shoe, depending on whether it's 6-deck or 8-deck shoe. In an 8-deck shoe, there's typically 82 hands on average if you have a cut card at 14 cards, but we're going to go with 80 hands. It'll make the math easier. Assuming a player can start playing at any point in the shoe, I'm wondering how successfully a mean reversion strategy can be applied if a player sees an abnormally high deviation from an expected mean. For example, if player wins 30 of the first 40 hands of an 80-hand shoe, can we expect banker to catch up and the results to revert back closer to 50-50 in the second half of the shoe? If you think this mean version has any validity, I would be willing to pay you to run your sims and work with me to develop the idea. Thank you. Well, okay, so this is an idea where we do understand that there is a mean for a shoe, an average number of player banker ties that occur in a shoe. And we have a situation early in the shoe where we are far away from that mean. And the question is this mean reversion strategy, which is to say we make money by the tendency of the world to go back towards average. Is that a strategy here? Well, I think it's a good question because in fact, we do head back towards the mean on average in this shoe. And I want to show you how that happens and what's really going on here that makes this voodoo. So let's get into it. First of all, I want to remind you of the gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy, also known as the Monte Carlo fallacy or the fallacy of the maturity of chances, is the belief that if an event whose occurrences are independent and identically distributed has occurred less frequently than expected, like banker hands, then it's more likely to happen in the future. Or vice versa. So if we've had too few player hands, we could expect more player hands in the future. If we had too few ties, then we could expect more ties in the future. If we're playing roulette, we've had too few reds, we should expect more reds in the future. These words independent and identical are important here, because essentially what this means is that the hands don't hold any history, right? The outcome of one hand, whether it's player or banker, really doesn't depend on the previous hand in any meaningful way. And that is true in baccarat to the extent that there is no meaningful statistical correlation. The way there is, for example, in blackjack, where if you were dealt a 20, then there's 2 fewer face cards, and that's going to change the edge on the next hand. There's nothing like that in baccarat. For all practical purposes, every hand of baccarat is identical in its odds to every other hand. Every hand has an identical distribution. The extent to which that isn't true, if you followed my videos, would allow you to earn about a cup of coffee worth of profit a day on $1,000 wagers. So we're going to just go with the fact that these are independent and identically distributed. Mean reversion, and this is what he's talking about, right? He's in finance. So mean reversion is very specific. It's a financial term for the assumption that an asset's price will tend to converge to the average price over time. It will tend to converge to the average price over time. In other words, if you have any extreme followed by time, then at the end of some time, you're going to be closer to the average. That's true also, right? That tends to be true also. So how can these two things both be true? Mean reversion and the gambler's fallacy. So the gambler's fallacy says if there's too much of something, then gamblers tend to believe there's going to be more of the other thing. Whereas mean reversion says if there's too much of something, then over the long run, we're going to get back towards the mean. Really good question. Let me explain. So once again, let's go into this particular question. For example, if player wins 30 of the first 40 hands of an 80-hand shoe, can we expect banker to catch up and the results to revert back closer to 50-50 in the second half of the shoe? So here is the setup for the question. Assume the first 30 hands are players out of 40 hands, so that 75% of the first 40 hands are player. How many players should we expect on average by the end of the shoe after 80 hands? And answering this question will show us the difference between the gambler's fallacy and mean reversion. So here we go. So here's the combinatorial analysis for baccarat, and you can see the probabilities in this column under P for banker wins, player wins, and tie. So this is what the actual mathematics says. Now, in practice, what it means is that the probability of a banker win is 0.4586, of a player win is 0.4462, and a tie is 0.0952. And that allows us to actually figure out the expected number of wins in a shoe. So in a shoe, banker should win roughly 80 times that decimal, or 36.69 hands, and player 35.7, and tie 7.81. And you might just take these to the nearest integer so that banker's 37 and player's 36, all right? So in half a shoe, just to really put a number there, in half a shoe, we might say that player wins about 18 hands, right? So what actually happened in this scenario is that in the first half of the shoe, player won 30 when they should have only won 18. So what the person is thinking is, I had 12 too many players. So clearly that's way too many. And this shoe really, really wants to have 36, right? And it already got 30. It's only supposed to have 36. So what the person who is under this idea of gambler's fallacy thinks is that the shoe's got to revert, right? It's got to do everything it can to try and get back to normal. And again, this is this idea that somehow shoes have memory. The cards have memory. The cards want something, that somehow the future depends on things that it simply does not depend on. The cards have no memory of what came before. They are just acting according to the laws of chance. So the gambler's fallacy is the belief that if an event has occurred less frequently than expected, it's more likely to happen in the future. If an event has occurred more than expected, it's less likely. So the gambler's fallacy believes that the shoe wants to get back to average. This is also known as believing the shoe wants to balance. The average for a full shoe is about 36 players. So if the first 30 of those 40 hands were player, then the shoe wants to only let more 6 hands be player. Best to bet on banker, right? So that's the idea here. Can we use this sort of tendency of things to be average to get an edge? That's what the person who wrote the email thought might be possible. Now, let's actually go back to mean reversion and show what the truth is here. So again, this is the assumption that the price will tend to converge to the average price over time. And let me show you how we can actually do that computation here. So let's talk about what the person who really understands mean reversion believes. Well, on average, independent events will be average. So that if there's 40 hands left to play in that shoe, then about 18 of them, and again, you just do this multiplication, should be player. Well, if you saw 30 out of the first 40 hands being player, that means what you should expect is that on average, in this particular shoe, there will be about 48 player hands. So here is what mean reversion gives you, and you can see it playing out right here. 30 out of the first 40 hands were observed to be player. That is 75% of the first half of the shoe, right, were players. Now, our forward-looking expectation is that 48 out of 80 hands should be player for the whole shoe. We are simply forecasting that things will be average in the future. But notice that if things are average in the future, 48 out of 80, that's 60% player hands for the whole shoe. We didn't revert back to the mean by forcing an excess number of player hands or banker hands. We simply said that assume things are normal going forward. Assume things are unpredictable and average going forward. And under that assumption that we had no information other than the information of what these averages were and the probabilities are, under that assumption, we see that we went from 75% for the first half of the shoe to 60% for the whole shoe. And 60% is closer to the mean of 44.62% being player hands than 75% was. In other words, we have reverted to the mean simply by having average stuff happen once we had an extreme event. That's all it means. That's what mean reversion is. Mean reversion is not information that something is going to change about probabilities in the future. And in particular, mean reversion does not allow for any meaningful predictions to be made. So I answered this person. This is the gambler's fallacy. I did not quite answer it in that way. Maybe I could have written it differently, but this is what I wrote back to the person. Hi. Forgive me for being direct with you, but as a professional futures trader, you should understand that reversion to the mean does not mean future events somehow compensate for a prior extreme event by doing the opposite to get back to the mean. That said, winning all comes down to information, and quite simply, there is no information in knowing the history of banker player outcomes of a shoe. Here is a video where I explain this. Hope this helps. And again, my apologies for being so direct. Well, I mean, I was direct, right? I told him that he didn't understand what reversion to the mean meant, or mean reversion, confusing it with the gambler's fallacy, that somehow things go out of their way to get back to the mean, rather than just, if things on average are average, then any extreme events get washed out over time and things start looking more average over time. So hope this helps, and again, my apologies for being so direct. And you will love his little response to that. You seem like a guy who's never made any real money in his life. Forgive me for being direct. Thank you anyway. So that is a statement that I just adore, because essentially this person has told me that all they really care about is the size of their genitalia. And you run into this all the time, sort of in male circles, where people, if you don't have the right car, if you can't prove you made the right amount of money, if you are not wagering enough in a casino game, if you're not getting enough comps, whatever it is, it's always my blank is bigger than your blank, and therefore I know more than you. So let me just say, this is exactly how you should never respond to something I share with you. I'm actually taking my time, my days, making you a part of my day. And I might be a little bit coarse or rude, but I'm not inaccurate. At least I didn't think I was inaccurate there. So, this is information, and I really don't care how large your genitalia are. If you want to believe things that are false, that is your right. And in particular, if you believe that you are making money as a futures trader based on the same theory that somehow there is voodoo at play in the markets, then you'll eventually lose. I'm glad you haven't lost to this point, and I do wish you well going forward. So that's about it, everyone. I think I've said more than enough in this video. So, all right, everyone, Sally Jacobson. See you later.